Joining our program now is Ron Maxwell. He is the award-winning director of the films Gettysburg and Gods and Generals. His most recent Civil War film is entitled Copperheads. And if you don't know, Copperheads is the term that Northerners use to describe, I think, mainly Northern Democrats, but maybe Republicans as well, who opposed the Civil War. Ron, welcome to the Peter Schiff Show.
Great to be with you, Peter.
Hey, you know, I just watched your trailer for the first time earlier today, and it really looks like a great movie. So congratulations on that. Tell me a little bit about your reasons for making this movie and about, you know, the Copperheads that inspired it.
Well, over the course of the 25 years or so that I worked on making both Gettysburg and then Gods and Generals, I came to understand, perhaps in a way that I wasn't perfectly conscious of when I started, that taken together, those movies are a kind of a cinematic meditation on why good, honorable, ethical men choose to go to war. And I explored that whether the men were wearing gray or whether they were wearing blue. If you know those films, they really give the opportunity for those men to explain to each other in the context of a drama why they're fighting, what motivates them. And so over the years, another question kind of like it was like lurking behind in my subconscious, which was why do good, honorable, ethical men choose not to go to war, and specifically the very same war? So when I came across this extraordinary novel by Harold Frederick that was published in 1893 about a Copperhead, about such a man, a ethical, educated farmer, a dairy farmer from upstate New York during the Civil War, who's opposed to the war, I just found this fascinating. And as you said in the introduction, Copperhead was a derisive epithet applied to those who were against the war.
Because it's like a snake, right? It's like you're calling somebody a snake.
Yeah, and in particular, a southern snake, because the Copperhead, I live in Virginia, and we've got Copperheads here on my property, and believe me, you don't want to mess with them.
Yeah, you know, and it's interesting that you're doing it from the perspective of a Northerner, because I think that there was much more support for the war effort down south. There were a lot more people who opposed the war up north. In fact, that's why they had the draft. I mean, you know, the South didn't have a draft. All the people who fought for the Confederate were volunteers. But there was conscription. The first time that we had a draft was during the Civil War, and there were many people that were in that war that didn't want to be.
Well, Abner Beach, as you see in the novel and in the film, he's standing on the Constitution. He's against slavery. He abhors slavery. He loves the Union. So he basically, on those points, he agrees with his neighbors. Where he disagrees with them, he doesn't think war is the solution. He thinks it's going to make everything worse. He doesn't want to see the sons in the village go off to war. He doesn't want them in harm's way, but he also needs them to work on the farm. This is all those farms depended on their sons and daughters working on them. Okay. And he stands on the Constitution, and he says, wait a second, a suspension of habeas corpus? Excuse me? Shutting down newspapers? Excuse me? Arresting dissidents? Excuse me? These are all unconstitutional methods which drive him crazy.
And we also, I don't know if your film explores this, but during the Civil War, that was the first time we got paper money. And even though it went away after the war, it came back. The Civil War was the first income tax ever imposed in the United States. And so it went away, but it was resurrected. But all of these things began, the precedent was established during the Civil War. So a lot of bad things, I mean, happened as a result of that war. I mean, I know ending slavery was the one good thing that came out of it. But the question is, could we have found a better, more peaceful way to have ended slavery? And I bet if a lot of the people, including Lincoln himself, when that war began, had they known in advance how many American lives would be lost, and the economic cost and even the aftermath and the cost of reconstruction and the animosity that process was going to bring, I don't even know if Lincoln himself would have wanted that war.
Well, you bring up a really good point, Peter. scholars are continually estimating upwards, revising upwards the amount of people killed, outright killed in the Civil War, based on a lot of scholarship and research they've been doing. The number is now above 750,000 killed outright. That well over 1.5 million terribly wounded. We'll never know what we now call post-traumatic stress syndrome. I mean, it's staggering. Nobody
and of
can
course,
get their arms around
the population of the country was much smaller. Yet, I think more Americans died in the Civil War than all of our other wars combined.
Well, this movie, I think one of the things that makes Copperhead unique is that it stays at the home front. So we see the effect of the war, the devastating effect of the war on families, on mothers, on fathers, on siblings. No one escaped the war. Even way up hundreds of miles away in upstate New York, far from the battle lines, the war intruded into every corner of those people's lives.
Yeah, and does your film does it go through the end of the war? I mean, what's the time period that it takes place?
It takes place in 1862, the spring to fall of 1862. What happened in that year? That's in the fall of 1862 is the Battle of Antietam. 20,000 casualties in one day. It's just mind-boggling. And we see the boys before that. We see them in the spring going off to war with high hopes. And then, unfortunately, sadly and truthfully, we see the way that they came home. And it also covers the election of November 1862, in which the Copperheads won. They swept except for New England, which was a bastion of Republican strength. They won New York State governorships across Indiana, Ohio. It was a huge anti-war year. Had it been a presidential year, many scholars think that would have been it. An anti-war president would have been elected. There would have been a peace treaty.
Yeah. Now, as I always think, when you think about the Copperheads, they're the Northern Democrats. But were there Republicans that were also Copperheads that were opposed to the war?
Yes, it was principally centered in the Democratic Party, which was opposed to the war to start with, before it was unleashed, and during the war. But you're quite right. There were what we today might call independents, today what we might call moderate Republicans as opposed to radical Republicans. It was a cross-section of people who politically thought that war was not the answer for a variety of reasons. And
it's not because they supported slavery, right? They probably were as much opposed to slavery as those who favored the war. It just was the method of abolishing it that they didn't agree with.
Abner Beach argues in the film that there are constitutional, legal, legislative means to right injustice in our society. I mean, today I don't think many people would advocate armed insurrection and warfare to solve our problems. As frustrating as it is, we know we must solve them legalistically in the courts, in the judiciary, and by legislative means, because otherwise people get hurt.
Oh, yeah. And, people go back now and you try to estimate, could they have bought the emancipation? Clearly, it would have been a lot less expensive to have done it that way. But, what if we had even allowed the South to secede? People just assume that, there'd still be slaves down in Alabama or Georgia. I can't even imagine that even had we let the South leave the Union, that slavery would have lasted more than another generation or so before it would have just disappeared on its own the way it did in every other country on the face of the earth.
Well, let's say a couple of things about that. First of all, we can all acknowledge that for one additional day for anybody to be held in servitude is one day too many. So we could certainly understand the frenzy and the impatience that possessed the abolitionist movement in the United States. But at the same time, you're quite right. Slavery existed in the entire Western Hemisphere, and no other country had a bloody civil war to abolish it. It was abolished legally through legislative means in all the other countries in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, so I find it hard to believe that America would have been the sole exception. And I think from a purely economic point of view, and I've argued that on this show, forgetting about the morality of it and the legality of it, but slaves are not going to be as productive as free men. It is cheaper to employ somebody than to enslave them. Because, the slave plantations had to spend about 90% of the slave's productivity just sustaining the slave. It was an extremely inefficient form of labor that would have died out on its own.
Well, it was inefficient. It was barbaric. It was inhuman. There's nothing good anybody can say.
Well, yeah,
about that.
I put all that aside and just focused on the dollars and cents. We all know that it's barbaric and never should have existed. But it would have gone away. But what happened to the country? For a lot of people, and I think your film is very important. They glorify that war. Hey, it was a great war. It was a horrible war. Maybe there was some noble purpose behind it, but it was a horrible war. It is the bloodiest. It is the worst period of American history.
Well, I think what exists in our society, and we have to be conscious of these things. There's a kind of a mindset, and I'm not making any judgments about it. It is there, which is that we fought three good wars. We call them the good wars: the American Revolution, the Civil War, and World War II. All the other wars we argue about. Should we have gone there? We endless arguments. Scholars, citizens. Everyday people. But those three wars are commonly accepted as, quote-unquote, the good wars. But, there is no such thing as a good war. My father fought in World War II honorably. He was a great guy. I've never had a better influence in my life than my dad. And that's why when I did the other movies, it was an exploration of that kind of a man who stands up and fights for his country, what he believes in. I get that and I respect it. I'm sure you do too. But at the same time, you have to understand these are horrific engagements, military engagements. And once war is unleashed, all bets are off. It's like the phrase "the dogs of war are unleashed." And our film in 1862. Remember, when it starts in the spring of 1862, the abolition of slavery is not one of the war aims. The North is fighting the war to save the Union. It doesn't become an additional war aim until after Antietam, when Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation and shifted and added to the war aims. And that added a whole layer of complication, both in the entire American society, regardless of whether they were wearing blue or whether
we could talk about that after the break, because a lot of people don't know that. Because the Emancipation Proclamation happened in 1863, well into the Civil War, and I think part of the motivation for that was not only to disrupt the South, but I think that what Lincoln was trying to do was change the nature of the war to make it more about slavery, to maybe weaken the support that the South might have enjoyed around the world, maybe from other countries like France, who looked upon the South as if it was a war of their own independence, much like our own Civil War. But by trying to make it about slavery, that would make the South's perspective or their it would make them look like the bad guys, because I think the impression was globally that the North were the aggressors and the South was fighting for more principle or freedom, and by freeing the slaves, he really changed the nature of that debate. But it didn't begin about slavery, and I think Lincoln often said that if he could have ended the war, preserved the Union, and left slavery alone, he would have done it. We'll talk about that after the break. We'll be right back.
Nine out of 10 historians agree. If Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine were alive today, both would be Shift Radio Premium members.
Somewhere up there, Thomas Jefferson is looking down with great pride.
Shift Radio continues right now.
We're talking with Ron Maxwell, who is the director of the soon-to-be-released film Copperheads, about the American Civil War and those in the North who were opposed to it. Hey, Ron, when is the film coming out, and how wide is the release?
It comes out this Friday, June 28th, in the first wave in about 75 theaters, mostly on the east of the Mississippi. And then on July 19th, it comes out at another about 75 theaters on the West Coast and in major markets like New York, Chicago, and Boston.
Now, you're the director. Did you produce it as well?
I produced it, yeah, so I get all the headaches.
Okay. And you financed it yourself, or did you have investors?
Part of what you do as a producer is find the financing, and these are just great financial partners, just as good as my partner on the other two Civil War movies, which was Ted Turner, as most people know, and I've just been so blessed because my financial partners leave me alone. They let me make the movie I want to make with total creative freedom. Nobody tells me how to make it. Nobody forces me to say this or that or edits it. So those three movies are really the work of an independent filmmaker with no censorship.
Yeah. Now, did the other movies? Did the investors make money on those?
Yes, they have. They were very long, as you know. The Copperhead.
Yeah, I saw them.
Copperhead is just 2 hours, like a normal movie length. But those two, the previous two, were 4 hours each, and that certainly limited the theatrical release. But they made a lot of money, and they continue to make a lot of money. I'm happy to say for my investors in home.
What was the budget on this movie?
The budget on this one was just under 12.
Oh, that's good. So, and you came in, you stayed in budget.
Oh, that's one thing I've always done. In 40 years of making movies, I never go there, my friend. People can love your movies or hate them, but nobody could ever say they're not made responsibly.
Yeah, so before the break, we talked about the Civil War and slavery, and what are the myths about the Civil War? And even, most school children are taught that the Civil War was fought to end slavery, abolish slavery. And though that may have been the consequence, one of the lone benefits of that war, that's not why it was fought.
Well, it was fought principally, if you listen to what people are saying, which researchers must do, it was fought because the Union split apart. One of the main reasons it split apart was over slavery. We can't deny that. The thing that the economic interests of the North and the South diverged between quote-unquote free labor and slave labor. And this started when the Constitution was written, and they kept on trying to patch it up and have compromises over many decades. It didn't work out. So at the root cause, just like most wars, is money. But the money was associated with slave labor and associated with, in the North, child labor and a lot of other awful things. So,
but I think, too, the southern states...
it wasn't fun. I mean, a lot of people were mistreated because of economic reasons.
Well, a lot of it, the North, as far as the slavery part, it was really the extension of slavery because the North wanted to only admit new states to the extent that they were free states. And the southern states didn't want that because they were afraid of losing their clout if the Union would increase. It would be increasingly represented by non-slave owning states. So to the extent that they were worried about the extension of slavery, that was part of the problem. But it was never the intention of the North to abolish slavery in the South until the war had already begun.
This is true. I mean, the war aims shifted, as any historian will say. 1862, after the Battle of Antietam, as you correctly, I agree with what you said before the break. The politics were intense. You had England and France and Russia and European powers ready to recognize the Confederacy, break the blockade, arm them. The stakes are high. Once war is on, the stakes are super high. Yeah. People don't want to lose. And the Republican Party, you're quite right, the political decision coincided with their wishes anyway. The Republican Party at that point was dominated by abolitionists. They genuinely wanted to emancipate the slaves, but it also coincided with their political interests to have the Emancipation Proclamation.
Yeah, because nobody wanted to. No, if the war was about slavery, nobody wanted to, favor the side that wanted slavery.
Yeah, well, so it was untenable. Of course, everybody knew it was untenable. The trade in slaves had been outlawed decades before, and there's no question about it that the slavery issue. It complicated enormously the equation during the entire Civil War in terms of what was going on in the country, what was going on in individual hearts and minds, and what was going on in the world political scene.
Hey, so what did you think? We don't have a lot of time, but what did you think of the Spielberg film?
Well, I have a lot of respect for Steven Spielberg. As I told him personally, my favorite film of his is Schindler's List. That to me is an
excellent film, yeah. But what about Lincoln?
But I mostly liked Lincoln. The only thing I didn't think Lincoln needed was we've seen the assassination many times in film. I thought it took away from the movie. I thought it would have been better if it just ended with the bells tolling on the passing of the 13th Amendment over. The film's done, and I think it would have been a stronger film. But that's a minor quibble.
What about historically? You think it was very accurate or had inaccuracies?
Well, there is a controversy. The folks in Connecticut are not happy that the Connecticut delegation is portrayed as voting against the 13th Amendment when they voted for it. So I can understand why folks could get upset. I try very, very hard in my films to get it right. We're not perfect, but we really try. I've got historians around me all the time, in the script, on the set, in post-production, and I'm saying, hey, if I made a mistake, please tell me. We'll fix it. So if you have
look, hey, Ron, it looks like we're running out of time, but I said from the trailer, it looks really good. So I'm very excited to see this film. Copperheads is the name. I hope it does real well. I hope your investors make some money, too. And, in fact, if you're interested in another film, if you need any other investors, maybe give me a call, because I think these are the kind of films, if I'm going to be invested at all, are the kinds that I want to be involved in. But thanks a lot, Ron. Hour 2 of the Peter Schiff Show is coming up after the break.